The music was loud. The champagne was flowing and everyone was laughing as if the world belonged to us that night. I was standing by the balcony a little apart from the crowd, the city lights dancing on my skin. That was when I felt it. The weight of someone's gaze. I turned, and for me, his eyes held a spark that made me feel like a woman again. Not just a wife, not just Madame Noah, but a woman. He smiled that knowing smile he always had, and for the first time in years, my heart rised enjoying. "The view, or is the party boring you?" he asked, his voice low. His words only for me. "It's beautiful," I said, turning back to the skyline, trying to steady myself. "The city always looks better from up here." I wasn't talking about the city. He replied it was dangerous, the way his words lingered in the air. I should have walked away. I should have laughed it off, pretended I didn't hear. But I didn't. The truth is, Brian had always been there. Always polite. Always charming. But something changed. After the wedding, it was the way he started to look at me. The way his compliments became personal. He noticed things no one else did. How I wore my fare. The perfume I chose, the way I fidgeted when I was nervous. It was like he saw me, the real me. Not the perfect image. The world expected that night was the beginning of the end, though I didn't know it. Then it started with stolen moments, quick glances, innocent touches that lingered too long. Whispers that carried more than just words each time. I told myself it was harmless, but deep down, I knew I wasn't the kind of woman who made reckless choices. My life was planned out, polished, perfect. But Brian was different. He brought a spark into my life, a kind of thrill I hadn't felt in years, and for the first time I was willing to risk it all. The parties became our playground, the crowded rooms our cover. He'd find me in the chaos, his hand brushing mine, his voice low in my ear. "You shouldn't be alone," he'd say. And I'd laugh, pretending not to understand. But I did. It was at one of those events, a gala for one of my charities, that things crossed the line. I had worn a red dress that night, bored and daring something my husband barely noticed. But Brian noticed. His eyes didn't leave me all evening. When I excused myself to catch my breath, he followed. We were alone in the hallway, the noise of the party feeding behind us. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "And you're the one who started it," I replied, my heart pounding for a moment. Neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, filled with everything we'd saying then. Before I could think, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. It was subtle, almost nothing, but it felt like everything. "You're the most beautiful woman in this room," he said, his voice barely audible. And that was it, the moment everything changed. It wasn't love, not yet. It was temptation, desire, something we couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I should have stopped it. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I let myself fall. And in that moment, the Noah. Everyone knew the perfect wife. The respected socialite began to unravel Effie's words. Stayed with me all night, even after I left the hallway and returned. To the party, I could still feel his presence like a shadow. My husband, Aji Ibrahim, was making rounds with the big names in the room. Senators, business, tycoons, oil magnates. He was in his element, shaking hands, laughing a little too loud at their still jokes. I smiled when necessary. Post for the cameras went cold, but my heart wasn't there. It was somewhere else with someone else. By the time we got home, the house was quiet. Alhaji retired to his study as usual, probably to go over the next morning's meetings. I slipped out of my dress, my mind racing, my chest tight. I told myself I was just tired, that it was all harmless. But deep down, I knew better. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between Brian and me grew heavier. He found excuses to visit the house more often, events to plan meetings with his father, even casual drop-ins that felt too deliberate each time I told myself to keep my distance. But it was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you could fall and still leaning. Forward one Saturday afternoon while I heard you was away on a business trip. Brian came to the house. He claimed it was to finalize details for a family event. But I knew better. The staff were busy preparing dinner, and the house felt too big too. "Quiet, you've been avoiding me," he said as we stood in the kitchen. "I've been busy," I replied. "Trying to focus on arranging the flowers in a vase. You're lying." His tone was soft, but his words hit hard. I turned to him, intending to put an end to whatever. This was but the moment I looked into his eyes. I couldn't speak. There was something about the way he looked at me, as if he could see every part of me. The Polish socialite. The woman who led too hard to hide her loneliness. The one who craves something more. "This isn't right, Brian," I said, my voice trembling then. "Why can't you walk away?" he asked, stepping closer. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't find the words before I could stop myself. I reached out to push him away, but my hand lingered on his chest. He placed his hand over mine. His touch, warm, grounding. For a moment, the world outside didn't matter. It was just us standing in that kitchen, teeing on the edge of something we couldn't take back. The sound of a door slamming snapped us out of it. One of the maids walked in carrying a tray of glasses. She froze when she saw us, her eyes deeding between Brian and me. "Sorry, she stammered quickly, turning and working out. The moment was broken. But the damage was done. "This is getting out of hand," I whispered, pulling my hand away. "Maybe Faye," replied his voice low, his eyes still locked on mine. "But you're not the only one who's fallen that night." I couldn't sleep. The walls of my bedroom felt like they were closing in on me. Alhaji called to check in, his voice calm, steady, a reminder of the life I was supposed to have. But all I could think about was Brian and the way he made me feel alive. Seen, wanted. I knew I was playing with fire, but for the first time in my life, I didn't want to be safe. The days that followed were a blur. F me, and I continued. Our dance close enough to feel the heat, but never enough to cross the final line. It was thrilling, intoxicating, and dangerous. Every stolen moment, every lingering touch felt like a secret we couldn't keep, yet couldn't let go of. But the walls were closing in. The maid's lingering glances, the way Ali's friends looked at me during parties, the SLE tension in the house. It was as if the world was starting to see what I was desperately trying to hide. One afternoon, Brian invited me to a private event. He was organizing. It was a glamorous lunch party for one of the city's biggest luxury brands. The guest list was tight, but the whispers in the room were louder. "You look stunning tonight," Brian said as we stood in a quiet corner. "You shouldn't say things like that," I replied, my heart pounding. "And yet here you are," he said, his voice low, his eyes piercing. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The truth was, I had no excuse for being there, no justification for the way I felt when I was with him. As the night went on, I noticed a woman watching us, a journalist known for her scandalous stories. Her eyes followed Faye and me like a hulk, her lips curling into a knowing smack. My stomach. "Ted, Brian," I whispered, pulling him aside. "We need to leave." "Now what's wrong?" he asked, concern flashing in his eyes. "She knows," I said, glancing at the journalist. "I can feel it." Faye followed my gaze and stiffened. "Let's go." We left the party, but the damage was done the next morning. The headline was everywhere. Family scandal. Billionaire wife and stepson caught in forbidden affair. My heart sank. The article didn't have solid evidence, but the rumors were enough to destroy everything I had built. Alhaji was livid, the house was in chaos, and the staff couldn't meet my eyes. Faye tried to reach out, but I ignored his calls for days. I stayed locked in my room, replaying every choice, every mistake, every moment I had let things go too far. I thought about my life, my marriage, my reputation, all the things I had taken for granted. Finally, you confronted me. Is it true? He asked, his voice cal but cold. I couldn't lie. Not anymore. It didn't go that far. I said, tears streaming down my face. But yes, there was something. He didn't shout or curse. He simply looked at me. Disappointment edged into his face. I gave you everything. Noah, he said quietly, but I can't give you trust again. Those words broke me in the weeks that followed. I moved out of the house. The media frenzy eventually died down, but the damage to my marriage and reputation was permanent. Brian and I never spoke again. He moved abroad to start fresh, while I tried to piece my life back together now as I sit in my small apartment from the glitz and glamour. I once knew I can finally see things clearly to every woman. Reading this, let my story be a lesson. Temptation will come, dressed in charm and excitement, but it will cost you more than you can afford to lose. Protect your home, your peace, and your dignity. No momentary thrill is worth the destruction it brings. Choose wisely, because the choices you make today will shape your tomorrow. All right? So the lesson for this particular story would be sometimes emotional gaps in marriage can make you look for fulfillment in the wrong places, instead of seeking that. From your stepson, use this moment to focus on your own growth and happiness. Take up a new hobby, pursue a passion you've put aside, or even engage in personal development activities like meditation or classes when you focus on becoming the best version of yourself. It not only improves your well-being, but also positively impacts your marriage and family life. And also, the moral should be personal growth leads to greater happiness and fulfillment, which can bring more positivity and strength into your marriage and family. Well, that's it for today. If you watched the video to this length, consider giving this video a thumbs up. Also, feel free to share your opinion and comments about this particular situation using your comment section below. And then also don't forget to subscribe to StoryPress so that whenever we drop a new video here on the channel, you'll be the first to be notified about our latest video. With that being said, see you all in our next video.